My story is, let's say this, I had to educate myself in many ways, despite the fact that I went through Scottish college education that was terribly, terribly not right and not good. So I tried JavaScript because that was the time of JS everywhere. There was JS, there was React, there was Node, there was Mongo, there was the entire stack. And the idea was you can just know one language and do everything in just one language, which seemed perfectly appealing instead of learning something backend and SQL, so 3 languages in total. Still, JavaScript was needed for the front end. I could just learn one. So I invested in that, but JavaScript turned out to be a huge, huge minefield that I couldn't comprehend really. And I actually built a startup with that was a marketplace for independent comic books, a very niche market. I managed to get 500 followers on Twitter, and it turned out that there were no sales, or pretty much none. So having very little money, I had to find a job and pretty much close the project. So that was my first startup experience. But after that, I understood that I want to explore further and find something else. So I stumbled upon functional programming, and I think it was actually Elm and Elixir that got me into that. I don't remember any other language, despite the fact that I checked Haskell and Clojure and probably something more. But Elm definitely was that. That was a very good entry point. And I learned that, and I got a job as a junior developer in England, actually. So that was the beginning of my story. And I developed a passion for functional programming very quickly, despite the fact that I'm not good at math whatsoever. And I also understood that you don't have to be good at math to comprehend it. So years later, when I started mentoring, it was a natural thing for me to just go sort of fully into functional programming and see how that will work. And it worked, and it works. And I'm actually surprised that it's not only bootcamps and courses where I have pre-juniors, sometimes people who actually were students of IT at university, but from time to time I also do workshops, mainly focusing on how to do FP, so functional programming. We typically abbreviate it to FP. How to do FP in JavaScript. And from time to time, I get a senior, let's say 10 years in front-end, senior front-end developer. I show him my idea of how to write declarative functional code, and he's like, oh, I didn't know you can do it so nicely. So that also validates a little bit my ideas. Okay, so how does it look like from the perspective of a person who joins a course, and how typically a full stack course with JavaScript, how do I try to approach the sort of trying to show them and show people that, hey, functional programming is something really worth looking into? So first of all, what I do not do, I think I tried actually some of those things at some point, and I very quickly realized they're not working. So don't use Haskell or Clojure or any other very alien-looking language that is actually very difficult that people do not know as any sort of introduction to it, because that's not going to work. Elm is already very difficult for people to comprehend if everything they know is sort of JavaScript, C#, Java, whatever that has a nice forest of brackets. It's impossible. Then don't use heebie-jeebies giving language, by which I mean interesting things like algebraic data types. Well, what the hell is that? Monads, class system, what the hell is that? And can you even explain it? Well, probably not. Endo functors, or whatever strange things that you can have with endo. Also not any weird language is a bad idea, and it's way above the level. Even stuff like carrying and recursion, that's really bad idea at the beginning, despite the fact that they can be explained in probably one sentence. Carrying is simply breaking a function with many parameters into a series of functions that call themselves with one parameter, and it's possible to explain it in JavaScript code in one line, but that's not easy. That's not simple. Understanding what it is and what it does is already difficult, but then how do I actually apply it and why does it make any difference? That's even more difficult. So that's not a good idea. Then saying that functional programming is all about math or lambda calculus, also not a good idea. It's just not a great introduction. And then also an assumption that people understand functions. Well, typically they don't. They have some idea what it is. They have probably an idea that something may go inside and they can call it and something is going to happen. But if they go through JavaScript, they already have one fundamental problem at the very least, which is function can return something, but it doesn't really have to. I mean, technically it will always return undefined, but the purpose of the function can be that it calls something else, does something outside, changes global variable, and so on. So they don't have a concept of pure function that only takes input and only returns output, and that's it. It cannot take anything from the outside. It cannot change anything on the outside. That's already something that is above their knowledge. And yeah, trying to make it fun. So what to do? Definitely use JavaScript and use it as simply as possible, which I will show in a second, because this slide show has only 4 slides. I am quite a minimalist in everything I do, coding included, and presentations I am just not a great fan of. So that's short. And then start with declarative style versus imperative, rather than introduce functional programming as such. In case you don't know, declarative style is a part of functional programming, but that's just a bit of it. So here from presentation, I really want to switch to just a console. Typically, when I do lectures, when I do any sort of live coding sessions, I use the console a lot and try to encourage people to use it too, because it's a really great tool. So typical and probably best example that I give is, so typical course looks like this. First, they teach people how to do for loops and for in, for off, how to do a while and while do, and people's heads are already spinning at that point. And even for loop itself, that's just not fun to write. Like it's something, yeah, generating stuff is great, so that's fantastic, but still people need to learn how to write it themselves. And at this very point, there is a huge chance that someplace here people make a mistake, because even syntax is difficult at first for people, let alone the fact that they have sort of 3 pieces here that are in no way described and people have to make sense of it. But the typical example that I show is, okay, so let's say you have an array, and that will be numbers, and let's have some numbers, and you want to add +1 to each element of that array, so that what we actually want to get in the end will be 2, 3, 4. A very typical sort of example when we want to learn simple loops and working with arrays. So, well, yeah, you have to do some new numbers here, empty array, and then you have to actually push to that something that, counts from numbers, and then I need to use index. So now what the hell is index and I? What is I? That's already a problem for people, and then +1. Okay, so how does it really work? Well, okay, so that's not super easy, and that's already, well, let's say 5 lines of code. And here we will definitely need numbers with length. And I'm hoping that I haven't made a mistake, because I write for loops kind of twice a year. I don't need them. So then, well, people usually say, yeah, that's difficult. I ask if it's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult. Okay, so I'm saying, what if you could write numbers and then use a method that is naturally on numbers, on arrays in JavaScript, and just here say, for each number in that group of numbers, just to that number add +1. And that's it. because the result will be exactly the same. And they're like, wow, I didn't know I can do this. And I found that this is the greatest selling point at the very beginning, which is, here you have to write 5 lines, here you just write 1, and it's really simple. And then I say, my way of writing that kind of code is that if you write map all the time and you have function here and you have well-named variable here, which is numbers, it's plural, then here naturally it has to be a number. So after a while, once you feel comfortable, you can just shorten that to n, which stands for 1 number. And then your function is super cute, super simple. And if you follow these rules all the time, then it's readable. That's fine. If you don't, then better just find longer names. So that's the first thing that I do. Then, let's go back to the presentation. Then I say, okay, so in that style, everything is just a function. And all you have to do is to group your functions, which comes here, inside modules. And modules are just files. And you just export these functions and use them someplace else. And finally, that's all you need to get started. And usually to that, I also add the very important information that essentially in functional programming, you will have data structures from which you derive actual real data, let's say users, let's say items, let's say a product in the store. And you need to write functions that actually do something very precise to these data and match the shape of the data, match the data structure. And that's all you have to do. And at first it's difficult, of course, as anything new, but it starts to click slowly, especially if I repeat it over and over again. Then it usually clicks with people. And then I can go a little bit deeper and go into pure functions, immutability, and higher order functions, which I consider sort of the 3 main pillars of functional programming for beginners. Like this is the sort of a foundation that people need to really build upon. That's what I found out. How do I look with time? Okay, I don't think I'm bad. Okay, so I say pure function, great. Basic pure function, just do something that adds 2 numbers. And you can do A, B, or sometimes I use number 1, number 2 if I am introducing people to the idea. Typically A, B people do, but A and B is not necessarily the most simple to comprehend for a newbie, for a pre-junior. So I say, okay, just give me the sum of these 2 numbers. If I call that function with 1, 2, the result has to be 3. And then I say, okay, so what is a pure function? Well, pure function satisfies just 2 things that you always need to remember about. The first one is that you have same input, and then that must give you same output. So if you call this function 3 times, it will always give you 3. Has to. If you call it 100 times, the last one also gives you 3. So there's nothing changing in your program. This function doesn't take anything from outside of itself. Let's say it doesn't use any global variable, doesn't use any store, doesn't use database, whatever, and also doesn't change anything, which brings us to the second rule, which I usually call nothing from outside. So it takes nothing from outside and changes nothing outside, or no changes, let's call it like that, no changes outside. Yeah, so 2 rules. I've been trying to simplify these things as much as possible for people over time. So that's my definition of pure function. I mean, its correct definition is just my wording, let's say. So that's the first thing. Then I explain immutability, where we just want to copy data all the time instead of mutating it, instead of changing it. So typically here, it will be here we have an array spread operator that in JavaScript comes super handy for that. And here I introduce people to more ideas like which methods mutate, which don't. Map, for example, doesn't mutate because it always returns a new array. It never mutates, never changes the numbers array. But I won't go further into immutability because that's a little bit bigger subject and I need to keep it short. But going back to pure functions, I always at the end show people how to actually wrap it as a pure function. So I say, okay, you cannot just take numbers from wherever you want. Let's say increment numbers. Let's do it like that. Maybe even let's do it like that, super descriptive. And I say you have to push that numbers through input because you always need to push everything through input. And that starts to make sense to people after a while. And we don't really need anything else. And that's pretty much it. That's a written function, nicely wrapped as a pure function. So that works for people. And then they see benefits because it's just pretty much one line of code, right? Which is fantastic. So I say, yeah, this is declarative style. Here you have imperative style. You need to do a lot of stuff, something. Here you have just one line. And that's fantastic. And you just wrap it in a function that is simple, well-named, very descriptive. It can be long. I don't mind long names. I think they're actually better than too short names, and so on. And finally, higher order functions. That is not always easy for people to understand, but the definition is quite simple. Actually, we can say a function in input or output or both. To a function, like input to a function. So we need a function that takes an input, another function, or returns another function, or does both. And then that will be higher order function, which is abbreviated as HOF, higher order function. So then it's actually quite easy. I'm saying you already know higher order functions because you used map, because you used filter and reduce possibly. So yeah, this is just it. Here is your callback function, the one that goes in input. If it goes into input, we call it callback function. So then it slowly starts to click. And the interesting argument and thing that I found lately, which is super simple, but super simple things, they happen to come relatively late, unfortunately, is that in JavaScript, pretty much every person who learns to be a web developer, front-end person will stumble upon, let's say they have a button that is already taken from the website and they have add event listener. Typical way of adding event in JavaScript, because JavaScript is event-driven, and without events, well, there's not much happening in the browser, really. So I say, look, here you need a function. Here is event, and here you do something. Write it like that, pseudocode. There's just placeholder here. So I say, listen, look at that. That's your higher order function, because it takes function as an argument, as a parameter. Here it is. And that slowly starts to click. Once I managed to get through to pre-juniors that JavaScript is heavily functional programming really driven, and without that, it doesn't really exist. And once they understand that, yeah, without higher order function, well, there is really no toying with JavaScript in the browser, because no events in the way that we know them, that's impossible. So that usually works. And that slowly starts to instill some passion, because they start to realize and break down the language into bits and pieces, where we can see that everything that I wrote is actually just a few lines of code, which is fantastic, and everybody is very happy about it. I've never seen a person not being happy about it from people that I mentored. And I slowly teach them how to move forward with that, which I think I still have the time to show. So let's just finish that. So yeah, immutability, I'm not gonna go further. Have fun, that's pretty much it. Okay, so that's my presentation. The last slide is just about me for the very end and for the QA. So then I say, well, keeping it concise and nice, clean code and pure functions as far as you can go, that's the way for you to go. So once they get introduced to the idea of CRUD, And in case you don't know what CRUD is, and by the way, there is at least one pre-junior here, so please excuse me, you may feel overwhelmed because I'm throwing a lot of names at you, and I try to explain them to the best of my ability, but the talk is short, and I'm trying to cover everybody from pre-junior to senior so that they can get something out of it. So excuse me. CRUD, what is CRUD? CRUD is create, read, update, and delete. Typical for operations that every developer needs to know how to do and understand. And these operations happen on the front, they happen on the back, they happen in the database. That's how we work with data. So we can create new data, we can read the existing data, and then focusing on the front end, we can display them to the user. That's sort of the idea. We can update them if they already exist, and we can delete if that's what we want. So I say, okay, let's try to do that. So if we have numbers, let's focus on numbers, or maybe not. Let's do it like this. Let's have some users, because that's a very good example. I'll just give them an ID, just for simplicity, so that we can do it quickly, and it just proves the point. So let's say we want to find the user so that we can read essentially from the user. So the verb that I'm going to use is get user by ID. That's the name of my function, and then I have to say users, because I always need to pass my data through the function if I want it to be pure, and I want them to be pure. And then I need to pass the ID that I'm looking at. And the syntax will be deceptively simple. What I want from here is that I just have users, and then I can use higher order function that already exists in JavaScript, which is find, and then for the user, each user in that array of users, I'm looking into each ID, and if that ID matches the ID that I'm passing to that function, then that's what's going to be returned. So that's one thing. That's our read. Okay, so let's now create user. With that, I still need to pass users, because I want to add a user to the array of users. And then I need new user. So here it will be even simpler. What I want to do is to create a new array of new users, which guarantees immutability, by the way. That's the way. We are just copying data, the users, and creating new data from that old data. And we are throwing the new user at the end of that array. So the new array will have all 3 users, let's say, if that's what we have. And then that will be the 4th one. And that's what's going to be returned from the function. So we have create. And then we want to update. That's usually what the keyword set is great for. Set user, we need users, we need, for example, ID, if we want to target a specific user, and then we want to change something. Here, typically, I will ask for a little bit more specificity. For example, we want to change user name, provided that we have also names, but assuming there are users, there will definitely be names. So username. So get the new name here. And then all we have to do is to map these users, which is a typical technique in functional programming, which is great because people learn techniques for actions, for CRUD actions. So we are looking into every user. And first of all, we have to find the one with the matching ID. And then say that if that ID matches, so we found our user, we are going to create a new user, so new you, with that new name. So the name will be changed, will be overwritten. And if it's not a matching user, which is pretty much every user but one, we just want to leave that user alone and not change it whatsoever. And that's how we can do update. And finally, we want to delete user by ID. Again, users ID, And again, typical way of doing it in functional programming is users filter. We have user again. We are saying user ID because we need to compare it by ID. And the only thing we do different is that we say the return from that filter. So the new filtered collection should have all the users, but the one with that matching ID. So we don't want that user with that ID in the new collection that will be created. And that's our way of deleting. And at first, it's a little bit confusing for people, especially these ways, because they have to learn it and they have to practice and memorize it a little bit and all that. But the wonderful selling point and the great joy of that is that I say, well, you have 4 lines of code and you are doing everything that you need to do, basic at least, with these users. And then you can use that. So that's sort of the selling point that I discovered, and I've been perfecting through different mentoring sessions and lecturing that I was doing. And as you can see, I managed to put it into just one sort of screen of code, which is, for me, that fantastic way of writing code. So that really builds some passion. Now, the great part of that is that I'm a huge believer in the fact that once people get a job, it's very often that moment when learning and really caring about the standard of writing code is much more difficult than it is at the level of education. Because at the level of education, you don't have deadlines unless they give you some homework, but that's completely different. There's no real money flowing through your company that you have to really be mindful about because, well, that's what pays for your salary and salaries of everybody else. So you can build really good foundations of your education, which is really what I care about and what I really want. So if you start with that, which is usually what people acquire through years of experience, and I did it as well through years of experience, and if this is your basic building block, then you can really stand on some firm ground because you have it. And my hope and belief, and from what I'm observing from people who been my mentees and now they're at work, their level of writing code very quickly becomes closer to mid-level than it is to junior level. So that's sort of the goal. Okay, let's get back to the presentation. That's sort of here you can find just a little bit of info about him, by the way. I've been a full stack for about 5 years, let's say 6 years ago. I did Elm with Elixir, which was definitely the most lovely experience. 2 years of lecturing in a Scottish college that, by the way, convinced me to never, ever go back to state education. And now about 4 years of full stack mentoring, and I also do career coaching as an CV review, preparing people for interviews and actually doing mock interviews, and also helping them to differentiate themselves, helping to find creative strategies really and use them of finding work, which this year matters much more than mattered previous year because it's a tough year for people in the industry. And that point that I made about helping people to think about programming and write their code closer to mid than to junior, that sort of leads me to the last thing that you can find here. That's the course that I just created. I just launched it. It took me several years to sort of have more and more ideas about how I think a really good course would look like. And this course is different than, as far as I know, than anything else I've seen. It's essentially for people who already know HTML, CSS, basic JavaScript, and basic React. If you don't know, but you're interested in the course, by the way, just contact me. There is a link on the website. I can give you one-to-one mentoring to bring you to that level. And it shouldn't take more than 2 months, I think. Just weekly meetings and a lot of homework and a lot of practice on your own. So what's the idea? Well, the idea is essentially that people will be working on a project that looks very much like a real world project, real world startup, so to speak. And they will be using all the modern tools, TypeScript, ChatGPT, any wonderfully easing our way of coding extensions in VS Code or any other editor they want to use. And all the knowledge that I can try to pass, all the experience that I have, and all the live code reviews and live coding that I will be doing for them every single week, on top of group meetings and mentoring the project for 6 months, because that's the length of the course, that will bring them much closer to mid-level than to junior level, and will help them get jobs in the difficult climate of year 2023. So that's pretty much all I got. Let me look at the chat. No, that's not it. That's it. If you guys have any questions, then please let me know. I will just go through that. I'll stop sharing. It will be perhaps a little bit less confusing.
Okay, so maybe I will start with my own question just to seed some discussion about the topic, and maybe what I would like to talk about is a little bit different from the very topic of your presentation, but my question concerns maybe the opposite of the topic of your presentation, namely object-oriented programming, because I'm wondering whether there is going to be a moment when functional programming replaces object-oriented programming as the main development-related paradigm in the academic curriculum. Because because from my perspective, and I basically believe that the meme that I've discovered recently that says, like, I had a problem, so I thought to use OOP, and now I have a problem factory. I think this is pretty much true, and describes in a quite good way the feelings I've got about object-oriented programming in general, because it was designed to
have problems that will never be solved.
It was designed to allow programmers to map real-life objects and events, and maybe not really events, but objects, their traits, and so on, the actions they do, whatever, to programming language syntax and so on. But over time, everyone was just like starting to hide this behind very complex and absurdly complex at times design patterns, which tend to be used quite blindly, and it gets farther and farther away from actually describing the reality, but just on the contrary, it makes the reality way more complex. I think this is polluting young students' minds in universities.
It has been for, let's say, 30 years. So back when I was a student in Scotland, I went to a certain university, met with a certain course leader, and I asked at some point during a 1 hour, let's say, interview or a chat, because it was quite informal, why do they push Java and C# instead of any other languages? Let's say Python, Ruby, PHP, something, JavaScript, something easier, definitely for people to grasp at the beginning. And they said to me that, Oracle and Microsoft are actually giving them money, just like all other universities, so that they actually use these languages. So that's unfortunately the truth behind it. Functional programming, if it becomes popular at the universities, it would be for some very miraculous reason that these corporations or any other corporations do not want to force their own languages and keep people in their ecosystems, let's say. So I think that's the reason. But that's a great question.
Yeah, but I think maybe there is maybe if it happens, then it's quite likely that JavaScript can be the first one which wins the battle, because right now I think the functional style of writing JavaScript code is quite heavily promoted.
It is, especially on the front end, thanks to React, I think. I think that Facebook and its entire ecosystem of different libraries that sort of changed the face of JavaScript and, well, made functional more popular. Okay, so I'll focus on some questions now.
Yeah, the first one is from Herbert.
Yeah, but I also have some questions on the chat, and I really don't want to miss. Sorry, I'm usually very crazy about answering all the questions I can. So, Daniel, you ask a very important question. How did we move from Elixir and functional languages talk to JavaScript? I'm really sorry about that. The reality is that even if I really, really want it, and trust me, I used to want that very, very strongly, mentor pre-juniors in Elm or Elixir or any other functional languages, there is no chance on earth that they will find jobs, unfortunately. It's very difficult. There's just a few companies that accept juniors that do functional languages, unfortunately, especially this year, but even previously it was quite tough. Curiosum, I think, is one of exceptions. Usually companies look for mids, they look for seniors, and they also typically look for people who know a few functional languages. And very often that's Clojure or Haskell or maybe something like Rust, which is not functional per se, but it's also one of those cool new languages. That's just not going to work. So the idea for the talk was to show how that can lead to going into Elixir, which I didn't really speak about, but to answer that, if people learn functional programming in JavaScript and they come across a company like Curiosum, they will be able to switch to Elixir much easier because all these concepts they already know. All they have to learn is the syntax and a little bit of quirks in the language, which will surely take a while, but I'm pretty sure the company would accept them much quicker than anybody who has never touched functional programming for obvious reasons. Okay, what else?
Yeah, I think this is a good point because we have been observing specific patterns of issues with people who have object-oriented programming experience and then try to switch to functional-oriented programming. And there is an issue of having too many. I'm looking for the right word for this. Too many habits moved over from the object-oriented programming world. And there has for quite some time there has been a misconception among some parts of the community, which were like Elixir is the new Ruby, and Phoenix is the new Rails, and this was like some kind of gossip which was passed over throughout the community and caused some people who didn't really care about any functional programming aspects to try to come into the Elixir ecosystem without really knowing what they're doing and treating Phoenix as if this was just the new Rails. But over time, I think the approach has changed, and basically this misconception is not as prevalent as it used to be, is it?
To be honest, I have no idea at the moment how it looks like. I would say that Phoenix has a great potential, but yeah, it's probably due to the fact that we have academia, we have corporations behind that really, and a very long time of that existing, that functional languages are virtually unknown. Any courses that are done in this world, generally, with very few exceptions, there are small companies that will do courses with Elixir, but these are small operations. Big ones, they don't really have a choice. It has to be JavaScript or Python, I think. Maybe Java, because it has its applications and market and so on. But yeah, that I think what you're maybe looking for, well, funny here, that people like me who start their own courses, small courses, start to working with companies like yours, and we try to build a pipeline from a course for just a few people so that they can go to your company and other companies. But for that, we need a better climate of the market, because at the moment it's just not possible from what I understand.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I can probably add to all of this is that junior developers with no significant experience in object-oriented programming languages are quite easy to be modeled to follow standards that you expect from a functional programming person, because they don't have all those habits moved over from some previous object-oriented languages they could have extensively used, and this is probably why we don't find working with junior developers as hard as someone might imagine, because customers often ask us why we offer. Obviously, this does not happen without proper support from seniors here and there. So you don't put a junior developer in a position where they have to be fully autonomous, because it just won't happen.
Yeah.
But customers tend to be scared about working with juniors at all. But it often happens that junior developers, properly tailored to the needs of Elixir programming in this case, fare very well in projects which allow them to just do their job, and at least for some initial period be supervised by someone more experienced. But over time, they become more and more self-contained. And this works quite well in many of the projects we've had.
That's great to hear. That's wonderful. Okay, so the first question is, should I focus to learn Elixir for writing REST or GraphQL APIs, just like... Oh, you threw it here. Great. Sorry, I'm still learning this platform. Okay, APIs just like the way I should use Node.js. Well, if I understand correctly the question, yeah, I would go for it. I mean, if I understand the question correctly, you're essentially asking, should you first learn how to work with APIs, how to write them, and so on? Yeah, if you already know how to do that in Node.js, I think there's nothing better for you than to take yours, especially small, something basic, Node.js API and rewrite it in Elixir. I would suggest with the help of ChatGPT, but of course, learn from it and still write your own code. Just use it for ideas and for some help. So that's it. Herbert.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And here comes the next question from Herbert. Should I focus to write my React.js code as a functional programming style? And should that be a plus for my CV as a developer?
Interesting. So quite possibly, unless you write class components in React, which you most likely shouldn't at the moment, rather write functional components, then you're already writing functional programming to a certain degree. And surely you're writing declarative. You can dig deeper into functional programming, especially, well, that's my advice, especially with libraries like Lambda, for example. I'll just throw it on chat. You can find it on the web quite easy, Lambda.js. A very nice library that helps people essentially move closer to functional programming, and you can just use very basic functions that you understand at first, and then you can dig deeper and see what that brings. So yeah, that should be a plus in your CV, definitely.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And here comes the next question, which is more like a comment from Herbert. It should be great for the next meetups to talk about Curiosum stack more in depth. For example, what other architectural and design patterns we use to design and code applications, how we use Elixir, CI/CD pipelines, and any other topics that can help us to understand how challenging it might work with a company like us. I think these are topics that we are going to cover in subsequent meetups. So stay tuned. I think if not in the next edition, then I think every once in a while we shed some light on what techniques we use for in a specific field. So Herbert, I think your question is going to be addressed sooner or later. And here comes a question from Quentin. As a junior developer starting with Elixir as a primary language, I find it hard to get invited to interviews for JavaScript or Python junior positions because of lack of commercial experience, even with projects built with those technologies. And do you have any recommendations to bypass that?
That's very interesting. To be completely honest with you, I never had a case of a person in that position, but I always love new cases because it broadens my horizons. You may want to tailor your CV so that you hide a little bit the Elixir part and put it as a secondary thing and push forward the JavaScript or Python. Because if you're not invited to interviews, well, recruiters very often have their own way of seeing things, and they just scan through CV and have some idea. It's maybe worth thinking about going through a CV from their perspective, from their point of view, which is they likely get, let's say, 100 and 200 CVs, and they have to browse through them somehow. That's my understanding of what's happening. So maybe they will put you on the pile of, well, he knows some language that I never even heard about, because they probably never heard about Elixir, unfortunately. And then there is some JavaScript, some Python. If you turn it around just so that you can apply to these companies, there's a much greater chance that they will allow you to be invited to interviews, and then quite possibly you'll be able to quite easily prove that you're just a good programmer. And that's it.
Yeah, I think maybe the two things I could add here are: do differentiate your CVs between the companies you apply for, because obviously if you apply for a job in which the main requirement is JavaScript, then what you want to do, and you have to put your focus on that very strongly, is make yourself look good as a JavaScript developer. And when you apply for a Python job, you want to make yourself look very good as a Python developer. So this is probably going to require some work from you on preparing a set of CVs which you can use for different companies, but this is going to pay off surely. And yeah, I think that's one thing. And the second thing is that maybe you can think of adding some strategic thinking to how you target those companies, because if you apply for a job in a large-scale company, then it's really a sure thing that you are going to be one of sometimes hundreds of people applying for a given position. And in that case, what Mikołaj said about recruiters having their own processes of picking and picking CVs that they want to view at all becomes even, in this case, it becomes even harder to get through the initial filtering of CVs, because if you get a few hundred CVs for a given position, that you are surely not going to read every single CV in detail, but you are going to be like, oh, I'm looking for a JavaScript developer, but he says his main language is Elixir, so what the hell? I'm discarding this straight away. So that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's quite possible that's exactly the way they look at it, despite the fact that the reality may be very different. And I think it's worth remembering that recruiters are 99 point something percent of the time not programmers. They never code it, essentially. That's how it looks like. Well, I think a programmer could understand that if you know Elixir and you are going to JavaScript, and if this company uses functional programming even just 50% of the time, then you will find your place because you're quite competent in that place and that position. But the recruiter will not have that idea, will not draw that conclusion.
Yeah. So that's an interesting topic, and I think this. I think we have a next question from Max, which I can't display because it's not in the Q&A chat, but in the general one. But it reads, "What do you think of strict types for beginners? Would they be too confusing? And I've heard types are coming to Elixir in the next few years."
To that I actually answered in writing, so I would just maybe reiterate what I wrote. Because I was essentially taught by Elm's compiler how to code, and by Elm. And Elm is purely functional language, which Elixir is not. It's just a functional language dynamic. And Elm does have a strict typing. And it really depends on certain rules, but very often when you use static typing, you definitely get a safer application, but you do spend more time on writing it and writing your functions right, and you cannot prototype as quickly as with something that's dynamic. That's my sort of experience. But in the end, you get a safer application. But with Elixir, my sense always was that because you have the supervisor system, that people can sort of just write dynamic code and will most often just work. But maybe it's just a little bit too little of my experience here.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see what developments time brings in terms of the Elixir's planned works at the type system, which Jose has announced some time ago. But overall, I wouldn't be too excited about this, because this is surely not going to be able to turn Elixir into a strongly typed language at all times. So yeah, that's it. Are there any further questions to Mikołaj?
I actually have a question, especially to those of you who work with juniors in your company. My question is sort of an interest in what do you find to be their best quality, and what do you find to be the worst quality, in the sense that they're not prepared for something, maybe for team working, maybe for understanding how to work on specific tasks or issues. I'm really interested in that, because that gives me some indication on how I can better prepare my mentees during their education for actually going to a company and being productive as quickly as possible, within reason, of course. So that's my question.
So I encourage you guys to type your own answers in the chat, but maybe I start with a remark that I think one of the greatest shortcomings of junior developers at the beginning of their journey with us is the lack of knowledge about the processes which are used in project management. So obviously we have to teach, if a developer is to join a project which uses an agile methodology of some sorts, like Scrum or Kanban or whatever else, then some time has to be spent on actually managing the junior developers' understanding of what is expected of which person in that kind of project management framework. And obviously there also comes the development of a feeling about who to ask about what, and which questions are best answered by a teammate, which questions are best answered by the client or the product owner in some cases, and which questions are best answered by Google. Because
Okay.
this often leads to situations where if the bias of if the percentage of questions asked to a specific party is too high, then that party gets quite a bit irritated because sometimes the client says, "Hey, this person is asking us too many questions about simple things," for example. Or sometimes if the person is not really inclined to use Google the way they should be using it, then we get irritated that the person is asking us about simple things without trying to find it out themselves. So it's quite difficult for some people. It's quite difficult to strike a balance between those aspects.
Okay, that's what I usually try to teach people very early on. Is that they should focus on their tasks for a while, but if they hit a wall and they really cannot think of anything else, then just ask somebody, because you're literally being stuck if you don't ask. So you're sitting on your butt and doing a bunch of nothing essentially, and that's not good for the company. That's not good for anybody. That's my approach.
Yeah. So we have a question from Christina. What is your view on nowadays interviewing process when some people say that with ChatGPT existing, nobody checks your pet projects done by tutorials, tech tests lose any value? And I'm asking because recently I had video recorded live testing, and they said that as a developer, I'm not allowed to use linters, Google, or ChatGPT. Like, devs need to remember everything from just from my head. I know no senior devs who would remember everything.
Okay, so that's really more than just one question. So I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. And first of all, congratulations on falling in love with Elixir. Great. And you also seem to have a really interesting experience. So if you can connect with me over LinkedIn, that would be great, because I'm curious to hear more. Okay, so I actually conduct and design mock interviews. And the way I always do it is that there is live coding. And so people get a task or a series of tasks, and they do it live with me. And I'm asking them to describe to me what's their thinking process, how they actually think, why they do, what they want to do, and so on. Because that's what I'm interested in. And from my experience, companies that I worked for that I was happy with had that sort of process in place, that recruitment process in place. They were much more interested in me than how much do I know in terms of some sort of knowledge. Because the assumption was that my personality, my way of thinking is much more important than my current knowledge. Knowledge can be increased quite easily. Changing the way of thinking takes months very often, and personality, that takes years. So what I would simply do is, if you had to record the video and you cannot use Google Linter or ChatGPT, well, that might be fine, because maybe they want to know how much you are managing from that core knowledge that you have inside, let's say. And then the question is, how do they make the decisions? If I was on the other end, I would assume that you would do maybe 50% of what you would normally be able to do with all the tooling, but I have no idea who they are. Maybe they're just people who think that you should be doing web dev essentially 7 days a week and so on, which some people really do think it's the way to do. I don't think so. There are different companies, different cultures, different places, and you're essentially on a journey of finding the one that suits you, that you agree with. That's what I would say.
Thank you for this answer. I hope this is satisfying for this few questions you asked, Christina, about. And the next one is actually about the thing you asked about the difficulties working with juniors. And Daniel points out that some of those include lack of knowledge in some other topics required to build backends, like having to teach them what a REST API is, what are some of the best practices, what are tasks, and how to interact with with the database.
So it's quite interesting, because some of these are, well, for a backend developer, they are quite basic API database, but the one about the tasks, that is something that falls more on the side of soft skills, I think. It's something that I mentor very strongly, so that people can break tasks into bits and pieces and they actually understand how to do them and not overdo them, not go outside of the scope, and keep it within the spec, within the specification.
Unless Daniel actually meant tasks like as tasks are defined in a language like Elixir. So this might be either a question about tasks in the project management sense, or tasks as understood as like asynchronous.
He just explained that these are background tasks that he meant. Yeah. So I understood it differently.
Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, this is made even more difficult by the fact that most courses of object-oriented programming languages, which are still the most popular things out there, don't really deal very well with any sort of concurrency. And even if they do, the concurrency model seen in most object-oriented programming languages has absolutely nothing in common with what we have in functional programming ones, like Elixir, for example. Elixir is a pretty special one anyway, but overall, I think this going forward, this might be a chance for Elixir to stand out as something which is quite easy to teach in terms of the concurrency model, because its concurrency model is really much simpler compared to all the semaphores, logs, mutexes, and whatever else we have in classical languages, so to speak. So I think when we reach a point at which the general public realizes that functional programming languages should be treated as first-class citizens in terms of actually teaching young programmers how to program in those languages from day zero, for example, at universities and this kind of occasions, then it's going to be very important to use this chance to make people understand concurrency way better than they used to.
Daniel actually points out something very interesting, that Elixir is like an OOP language in the original sense of OOP language. So I agree with that. OOP has changed a lot in the 90s when Oracle pushed Java and Microsoft pushed C# as a pretty much new industry worth apparently millions and millions of dollars, because they invested very heavy money in that. But Smalltalk is probably Smalltalk is probably a great example of what OOP used to be, where, if I remember correctly, the creator of Smalltalk actually said that he made a mistake in naming, focusing on objects instead of messages, and it was really all about messages. And yeah, the first thing I think about when I hear messages is Erlang and Elixir.
Yeah, and also one more funny thing about some later languages is that I think Ruby is the one which has a object oriented model which is closest to Smalltalk in many respects, but it also has its flaws. Like you can have, if I remember correctly, you can have because in the hierarchy of types there is an object which extends basic object, and basic object itself is a class, so it has the type class. And what type does class have? Class is basically extending from an object. So you have so you have something which you think you can go. You think you can have some very basic types like basic object and so on, but you can't escape from some more defined types in the hierarchy. So that's quite paradoxical, and this is one of the things that made me dislike the language over a few years. Yeah. So anyway, this is probably the last question we've had, or maybe there is someone else typing. So let's maybe wait one more second. Yeah, so we have a message from Christina, and probably this is about a reply from Max, which pointed out that linters or Google are 80 to 90% of programmers' work, and GPT might be banned for a security reason, because you are actually uploading your code to someone's server. So it's probably one more interesting thing that we should be wary of in the future when trying to resolve our issues at work. However, it might happen that the same thing and the same kind of security breach can occur with just using Google, which is something very few people think about in terms of security considerations.
No worries, Christina. It's just the name. She made the typo. And Daniel is saying something about Haskell. When we talk about Haskell, it's a language that we should stay away from. Do you think we are still behind in understanding these concepts? Because from my understanding, managed side effects is a big thing. It's a great question for somebody like me who grew up pretty much on Elm, because Elm simplifies Haskell. It takes all the syntax from Haskell. That's where it started, and then it started simplifying it, and version by version, it is still trying to get to the bare bones of a language. But it manages side effects, and it does it very, very well. And focuses primarily on focuses entirely on SPA's single page applications in the browser. So I think there is a need to understand that there is a difference between Haskell and everything that it offers and just managing side effects. Managing side effects is brilliant, but Haskell is very difficult to learn, especially for a beginner, especially for somebody who has absolutely no idea what functional programming is. Like understanding a monad, that's not something that any beginner should have to do. It's just not fun, it's not easy, it's not useful in any way for a beginner. So that's not gonna fly. Maybe that's why it's at the universities towards the end of their studies, because that's sort of a point where people can try to wrap their heads around it.
Yeah, I think some of those less popular and maybe less general purpose functional languages have found their niche somewhere. For example, Haskell, I think there are several cryptocurrency projects and blockchain projects based on that. So it's not like they're not used in production at all.
Oh no, actually Facebook hires about 50 Haskellers. Their entire spam filter is built in Haskell, as far as I know. So Max is saying it's great to learn, but not for production. Actually, I think it's great for production. Also, No Red Ink uses it. It's the company where Evan, the creator of Elm, actually develops full-time Elm, and they have, I don't know how many Elmers there, but they also have Haskell. So they do now Elm and Haskell, and they used to do Ruby on Rails. And Haskell is brilliant. There is a library in Haskell that essentially allows, at the time of compilation, that Haskell goes to Postgres, checks the validity of data types as the data returns back to Haskell app. And that's at the compile time. So, well, for them, it's brilliant. I have no idea how it would be for anybody else.
It's probably never going to reach a point at which it's like it can be treated as a general purpose language like Elixir is at this moment. So it's not going to gain nearly as much traction commercially as languages such as Elixir, which do sacrifice some of the purity for a better developer experience, so to speak. And this is what Elixir does particularly well. So the last question comes from Abdul, and Abdul is asking for advice or suggestions on how to effectively market his Elixir skills and experience to prospective employers. Specifically, he is interested in learning more about the best strategies for highlighting my commercial Elixir experience during the job search process. Additionally, any insights into the current demand for Elixir developers and the key qualities that employers look for in candidates would be valuable.
So I can answer that partly, and I think, Michał, you would like to answer the second part, or wherever you gone. So the first part I can, you're back. The first part that I can try to answer is, if you are looking for something outside of Elixir, that's what I understand from the beginning of the question, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're just asking for Elixir developers. So I will try to give something, let's say, a bit more generic. The big question is, what kind of projects have you done already? What was their business domain? So let's say that was healthcare, just whatever. Try to find employers who are looking for somebody in healthcare industry, in medtech, who are interested in functional programming. Maybe that will be Elixir, maybe not. But if you know Elixir, you know functional programming. You can learn a new language. You can convince them that your additional qualities, your knowledge of the industry, your knowledge of the business domain, building apps specifically for that, any other qualities that you have as a developer, from team playing to being friendly to being empathetic to being whatever, that can play a role, and maybe you will manage. Maybe that will be enough, even if that's not Elixir. And if it's Elixir, well, I would definitely look for companies with Elixir, and then try to highlight in your CV the best you can projects done with Elixir. Definitely use Elixir logo and maybe a little bit of that purple color, if I remember correctly. Yeah, that was purple. Maybe that's one way to do that, to generally just tailor your CV towards, hey, I'm an Elixir developer. I would make it quite purple. That's what I used to do. And show your love for functional programming in your CV somehow. Be creative.
Yeah, I agree with you that probably, as I said, you are going to be joining a very competitive market, and you are going to participate in a battle of CVs, a battle of people who want to make themselves seen and noticed and singled out as someone who is worth contacting, and someone who is worth hiring, and someone who is worth trusting in the long term. So this is probably no more about applying to many companies using just one strategy, but about okay, because in sales or this kind of this kind of processes, there is often a talk about account-based contact, which generally is a term which includes very specifically okay, about ways of contacting a specific entity in a very tailored and a very specific way, which is supposed to be a good match to the other party's needs, character, business environment, and all the aspects like that. So you should be thinking this way when approaching companies which you think you can add a value to when they hire you. So that's one thing. And the other thing about the last part of your question, because you are asking about insights into the current demand for Elixir developers and the key qualities that employers should look for in candidates. So I think similarly to all the other, similarly to the general IT market, the demand gets lower this year. There is basically a shortage of open positions, especially for less experienced developers. So this is true. Even we don't actively look for junior developers right now. Basically, we always have open channels of contact for interested people, but currently we are not in a position to hire anyone. So this is probably not the right moment to think of this. But overall, the key qualities that we are looking for are still the same, but maybe the bar is set a bit higher than usually, because the first thing is that for junior developers, we expect you to be able to become autonomous in some time, and sometimes it takes 2 months to reach a level that we are satisfied with, so we can say that you are on track. You still need some support, but you can be basically you can resolve tasks on your own without too much support on a constant basis. Sometimes it takes more, like 4 or 5 months to reach this kind of level. This all obviously depends on what you come to us with in terms of experience and expertise, because some people coming as junior developers to us come with a level of experience in personal projects spanning like a few months, and others come to us with nothing, with basically no knowledge about Elixir prior to applying for the job. So they really have to embark on a steep learning curve in that position, because the first thing we demand from you is to create an application which covers a very broad range of topics. Yes, it is centered around Phoenix, but there is quite a lot of aspects of web application development which we require you to cover in this app. And you get, for example, 3 weeks to perform this kind of tasks. So you have the chance to take your time, assess your current knowledge, gain some new skills, read some documentation, And if you are able to use the rest of the time to build a project which satisfies the requirements, then it's quite sure that you are going to be a good fit for the position, because after joining us, we are going to teach you about all the aspects of a developer's work, which have already been discussed here, in terms of managing projects, working with the team, balancing the sources of balancing the targets of questions you might have, and all this kind of stuff. So this is what you are going to be learning at the beginning of our cooperation. So yeah, during that period, it becomes apparent if you are able to develop this kind of key qualities that we require from everyone, or whether it's not going to work for you. So maybe that's it for me. Yeah, so thank you very much, Mikołaj. You presented a great talk, and there was a great Q&A session after that. So we were very happy to have you with us and present your talk about instilling the love for functional programming in junior or pre-junior developers. So please make a big applause for Mikołaj. As I said, Mikołaj's talk was great, and I hope you enjoyed that. So thank you for being with us today.